Welcome to the Tracking Connections podcast, and thanks for listening.
We feature voices from around the world sharing stories of working intentionally with deep nature connection in ways that transform lives, families, projects, and communities. I'm Sarah.
I'm Aiden.
And I'm Jon.
And we are your hosts from Living Connection First.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Tracking Connections. And we are in episode 3, where Aiden and I get to hear from and reflect with our own co-host and my partner, Sarah Fontaine. Sarah is an amazing healer. She's been a body worker for many, many years and an energy worker, and has gone deep into naturalist studies. She finished the Kumano Naturalist Training Program and went deep into tracking, holistic tracking. And she's been combining her love of tracking, of healing, of deep nature connection awareness with her understanding of the nervous system, and really helps to help us understand why what we're doing works with regards to designing with natural cycles, but with all the things that we're practicing in this deep nature connection mentoring work we do and people connection work that we do. So that's Sarah, and I'm excited to hear from you today, Sarah. But maybe what we'll do first is have Aiden say hello real quick, and then he can pass it to you.
Yeah, hello everybody. And I'm excited to hear from you today, Sarah, and hear what you've got to share with us.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to talk about how the 8 Shields principles are essentially a map to our original design of interconnectedness with nature and each other. And as Jon likes to call it, to our ancient nervous system. And I want to talk about it through the lens of the senses and also in our relationships with other people. But first, I want to talk about through the lens of the senses, which is one of the kind of foundational layers of the 8 Shields principles. So when we think about our senses, our 5 senses, including interoception and proprioception, we have many, many ways of perceiving the environment. So essentially, that is what we're doing. We're experiencing our surroundings through our senses, right? So we receive information from the environment, and it goes into our awareness first through the brainstem, which is our most primitive aspect of our brain, and then it's filtered through the limbic system and translated by our cognitive mind. So we go through these 3 kind of aspects of our awareness as we're perceiving our surroundings. So the brainstem, again, is our most primitive aspect of the brain, and we receive information at that place mostly below our consciousness, right? Some people develop a deep awareness where they're picking up on those environmental cues, but most people, it's preconceptual. We're experiencing our environment from a place that we're not aware of. And then as we move that information into the limbic system, we are patterning it against our memory. So we're patterning against our past experience to give us reference on what the meaning is. And then our cognitive brain is where we're then assessing what the situation is and how to respond to it. So the primary purpose of the nervous system is to keep us alive. So we have areas of the brain dedicated to constantly scanning for cues of danger in our surroundings, from the environment, from animals, and from other people. So, we have evolved our nervous system over millions of years with absolute interrelatedness and interdependence with nature. Our senses, for that whole time up until a few hundred years ago, were immersed completely in the purity of nature, right? So our main threats were predatory animals, environmental extremes, and conflict with other people and groups of people. But when we look at that, living in connection with nature, threats from predators were minor, right? Compared to potential threats that we have or we perceive as a modern human. And environmental extremes as a person living in nature were things that we were already in connection with, right? They the deep, deep cold was something that we could understand and we could work with. And then conflict with other people was probably a lot less, right, than the way that we're interacting with people at such a high level with such high population density in modern times. So if we look at the shift in sensory input that we've experienced in the last 200, 100, even 40 years, right, how going from the sounds of nature, right, the birds, the feeling of the wind on your skin, the sound of water, the smell of crackling fire, sweet grass and cold rain and hot sun, and what were those natural sounds that we were totally attuned to and in flow with and had meaning and interrelationship with, right, versus what our senses experience today, overstimulation just from work stress, right? Many people, if we're out in public, there's lots of voice noise and traffic noise, and we're experiencing human-made products like, the plastics that are, our desks are made of, or the chairs that we sit on are made of, and scents like fragrances that are made from chemicals. So we have all this unnatural input coming into our senses, into our awareness, that our nervous system is assessing, right? Like, am I safe here? and it's going off this ancient nervous system, coming up against all this newness that's not necessarily something we are innately having information about, right? We're having to assess all this kind of new information and the kind of extreme of information, and relatively harsh compared to the sounds and tastes and all the experiences of nature that we have evolved with. So essentially what happens in our nervous system when we perceive threat from the environment, and again, that's a perceived threat. So the point is not actually whether or not we are in danger according to our nervous system, it's whether there's a perceived threat. So it's in that assessment place where, it could be an angry tone of voice that we perceive as a threat, even though we're not necessarily in danger. It could be a loud noise, that somebody makes across the other side of the house. At a level, our body is responding to that. And we all have various degrees of resilience and responses, but there's a constant kind of assessment, and our body responds or may respond with sympathetic arousal or shutdown. So our bodies are meant to respond, with sympathetic arousal for short periods of time when there's true danger. Our body is meant to go into activity and hyper awareness when we're being stalked by a mountain lion, and when we're in a fight for food or something like that. So our nervous system is meant to have short periods of time to be effective at survival, right? And then return to homeostasis. So then there's most of the time, our nervous system wants to be in this place of homeostasis where we're relaxed, we feel safe, and we are getting all of our needs met. And so as a modern human, we're spending way more time in that sympathetic arousal or shutdown than we would be naturally. So that place of homeostasis that where our bodies and our nervous system is constantly wanting to get back to, that's our optimized state where we can heal our own bodies. We are creative. We are connective with other people. And so when our senses become overwhelmed with excess information or information that could be perceived as threatening, we basically start to shut them down because we're not able to process the information. So a lot of us as modern humans have kind of desensitized our senses as a form of protection to not overstimulate ourselves. So essentially, we can use the HCL map going through, taking inventory of our senses, and use the practices such are laid out in what was called the Kamana Naturalist Training Program that we're rewriting right now. But basically, we can practice tools to use our senses intentionally in nature to kind of reopen our nervous system back into its original design.
Well said. I want to underscore something that you said about, when we think about, for instance, the San Bushmen in the Kalahari and all the dangers that they live with. They can't hide from, right? They don't have hard-walled buildings, chain link fences, cars to climb into, guns, but they live with African lions, they live with hyenas, which, are a danger to their children for real. They live with rogue male elephants and many species of poisonous snakes and scorpions, and the list goes on. Cape buffalo, there's so many, as I like to say, there's so many ways to die in the Kalahari. And you would think that these people would be in a constant state of hyper arousal, right? But they're not. Because as Sarah was talking about, that interrelationship that they have, that deep connection with their place, they always know where the lions are. They know where the hyenas are, right? So they attune enough to know when they're in danger, and when they're not in danger, they go right back into that homeostasis baseline. They're some of the most relaxed, chill people I've ever hung out with. And I think about, like, where I grew up in New Jersey, some of the moms of the kids were so freaked out about stuff in nature, and they helicopter parented over their kids, oh, don't go out there, there's poison ivy, oh, don't go there, you might get ticks out, could you imagine them in the Kalahari? So I really want to contrast that, because what Sarah's describing, in modern times, we've normalized that state of perceived threat, right? Because obviously, where Aiden and I grew up, New Jersey, there wasn't anywhere near the natural threat level that is in the Kalahari. And yet, the parents were hyper freaked out by it, so it just kind of shows you sort of the normalized baseline of modern people, where they don't know the difference between what is a true threat versus what is maybe what I would call a psychological fear or projected threat, right? It's a figment of the mind, right?
And that's where that information, like, so the information from our senses comes into the brainstem in a very objective way. It comes in as data. And then when it goes to the limbic system is where it's getting patterned against a past experience, right? So we have associations. That's where our associations come in. If we associate snakes with, danger, that's where our emotional memory comes in to say, automatically, that snake equals danger, right? So that there's an opportunity there to catch yourself with your cognitive mind, to acknowledge your response, right? And reassess the situation and reinform yourself. What is actually happening? Am I actually in danger? And then you can start to resolve those reactions that we have conditioned ourselves to.
And, I'm also hearing a really interesting trend there, which is essentially the less relationship and connection you have to the reality of the situation, the more your psychological fear takes over and you're acting from that place. But like in the case of New Jersey, I think ticks are probably our biggest hazard when we were walking around, and you would have parents that just wouldn't even let their kids go outside because of fear of ticks. But when you actually learn the ways in which to interact with ticks to keep yourself safe, then ticks just become sort of part of your day, and they're no longer a fear anymore, right? So by developing that relationship, and actually, my wife and I, we would go on walks, and one of the things that we actually got to the point where we thought ticks were cute, because you would see them on their blades of grass holding on with their back legs and holding their little front legs up on the blade of grass to try to catch whoever's going to walk by, and you're like, oh my gosh, that's so adorable that you do that. But we never would have been able to get to that sort of place of almost like admiration and sort of joy from the ticks if we were still sitting in that space of, oh my gosh, what happens if I get a tick? Am I going to get Lyme disease? Is this going to be the end of my life? Like, you spiral with it, right? You can make up this huge story, but then when you actually develop the relationship and you're in connection with it, it is still a hazard, but it is no longer a fear. And I think that's a huge piece of growth. And it's really interesting to hear the Bushmen, essentially because they didn't have a choice, because they're in the environment, they don't have the choice to avoid these hazards. So instead they develop a relationship, and then the fear is almost entirely mitigated from that, I guess, except for appropriate fear. I imagine when a lion is literally charging at you, you may use the appropriate fear in that moment.
Yeah. that choice point that I just want to make it fair for people to understand that so much of this is happening below our awareness, right? So that building connections that you're talking about, Aiden, is getting us back into that place of pure connection, right? Where the data comes in and instead of kind of taking over below our conscious awareness, we're now intending to have a relationship and understand the lion or the tick and bring it into our cognitive awareness and change the way that we feel about it, what our experience is of it within the limbic system of feeling and implicit experience. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, I see it as almost a unifying of those three sources of consciousness or information or whatever we call them, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly.
When you really get to know, and this is something that Tom Brown emphasized with my mentoring as a child, he had me go straight into the things that I was afraid of and to really study them and to really build that connection, and that way, when I got that information, that raw data from what I was sensing in the environment, now the experiences I've had with that being or that element now were actually no longer based on past experience or projected fear that may have come from my mother, for instance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now those things are gone because now what I actually had was, no, this is really what this is, and this information, this data that's coming in through my brainstem and into my limbic system is now more harmonized because, oh, I have a relationship with this being. And then my thoughts are totally different about it. Like Aiden, it's cute. Oh, that's kind of cute, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I see the Bushmen doing that similarly with the lions, where they're actually laughing at something that the lions did, like they're not in that state of total panic, because they raise their children to go directly into that relationship with everything around them so that they will have the proper aligned, unified response between those three aspects of their nervous system. Of course, they're not thinking about any of that, but that is the result.
Yeah, and the practice of going out into nature and tuning into all of our senses, one at a time, and then eventually all at the same time. But say we go out and we are tuning into our visual field and also what we're hearing. When we're in that state of presence in a natural place, we have the opportunity to become aware of, what's going on behind the scenes in my mind. You start to kind of hear your own inner voice or inner responses that you're not always aware of when you're out in that natural environment, that where you can start to feel safe enough to really open up the senses. A lot of people will kind of cover their ears when they're in busy places because there's just too much information. So if you go to nature and start really listening, you'll actually have that healing experience of the discomfort there in the sense of hearing, where you'll start to realize how sensitive you are and maybe even become more sensitive when you're around those loud environments. But it is actually moving toward building resilience and clarifying the senses, right? So the associations start to come to the surface and are in a place where they can be resolved.
Wait, I love that. So if we went around the wheel of senses briefly, when we're looking at the eight shields, that first shield, which is about, the species of the first shield are hazards, right? And the goal you're aiming to develop is common sense. So in the beginning, of course, we use our eyes to look for poison ivy. We use our eyes to look for lion tracks, right? So hazard awareness is often about eyesight in the beginning, especially for children. So we associate that hazard shield or hazard pedal with eyesight, though, of course, every single one of the shields, you're using all your senses. But, we emphasize the development of eyesight in that first layer. And then when someone turns around, 9 years old, they love to go on fun adventures. They love to play games, right? They want to gather berries. They want to catch fun things like crayfish. And so it's very in the body. It's very kinetic. And so we associate that sense with our imitation and our movement, our dance, our body language. And that's where proprioception and vestibular sense lies in that wheel. And then in the third shield, we're learning to look for tracks and sign. And ironically, you would think eyes. But one of the things that Tom did with me was when I started to really study a track, he would always make me stop and listen. He said, because you don't want to fall into your eyes completely and lose touch with the environment, because that could cost you your life, right? And you can just imagine how, right? You get so focus locked when you're tracking that it's important to multitask and really listen at the same time, because bird language is going to tell you where that animal just moved to. Even though you're looking at the track here, the animal's right over there. But the birds are telling you that. But if you get focus locked, you'll miss that whole cue. So hearing is emphasized in that third shield. And then in the fourth shield, where we're really getting into our bodies and touching the earth, we emphasize tactile sense and touch, right? And this is where we interact with the surface of the earth and the surface of our body, which is our skin, right? So that's how we look at that one. And in that fifth shield, we're looking at olfactory, which is our sense of smell, because that west shield is really about ecology. It's about what's going on around us. What are the interrelationships around us? And olfactory often tells you it's fall now, the leaves have that smell, right? Or, hey, I can smell the salmon in the air, so I expect to see ravens and eagles down by the river. I smell the berries are ripe. Literally, you can walk by a berry bush and one day suddenly you smell ripe berries and it stops you in your tracks, right? So olfactory is often linked to ecology. And then in that sixth shield, we're looking at what you were calling interoception, inner tracking, paying attention to the cues within our body. And then the seventh shield is where we emphasize taste, which is about survival. The notion is, from some of the indigenous elders we worked with, your taste will tell you what you need to eat and what you don't need to eat. In modern times, of course, that's been completely skewed because we have so many artificial tastes. We're not living directly off the land, whereas when we craved sweetness, we went out and found berries, right? And that probably helped some nutritional need that we had. And sometimes we crave bitter and we eat a dandelion leaf and then we eat another one, but the third one is way too bitter, so we stop. So our taste bud says that's enough of that, right? So that's how we associate that seventh sense category. And then the eighth sense category, which is associated with the eighth shield, which is that pre-dawn kind of energy awareness time. This is where we take all of the other seven and we try to bring them together all at once. We might call it a sense meditation. But you can artificially meditate on each of your senses one by one and turn them on one by one and pay attention to them. But the storyteller's mind is when you do all of them at the same time in your storytelling. So you're living the story anew as if you're really in the story and you're not in front of an audience. That's a very potent integration tool. So I just wanted to, give you all, because Sarah was mentioning, the 8 shields of the senses. So I just, wanted to bring that detail out for you.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I also wanted to share around our connection with other people. So we also evolved as a social species. It's believed that our success as a species is because of our social cooperation and coordination. We learned to find safety in numbers, essentially, cooperating for protection, but also coordinating for gathering food and raising children. And we have that innately in our nervous system, the need to connect. And one theory that speaks to this quite directly is the polyvagal theory by Stephen Porges, where he studies the vagus nerve and how our nervous system interacts with each other in social experiences. So the principles of the polyvagal theory are that we are wired to connect. We are wired for connection with other people. So his theory speaks specifically about other people. I believe it also pertains directly to our relationships with nature. But for now, we'll stay with the people part. So it's a biological imperative. We need connection to other people for our survival. That's how we are a successful species, and it's in our nervous system that in order to connect, in order to actually feel safe in our environment, we need connection to other people. And we need to feel safe for that connection to happen. So we actually have parts of our brains specifically for scanning for cues of threat in other people. threat or safety. So when we're in a social atmosphere, or say we're having a conversation with another person, we're reading their face and their body language, the tone of their voice, what they're doing with their eyes, looking for cues of safety or threat. So this is happening mostly below our awareness. And so when we feel safe, we then feel able to connect. And when we're in that safe and connected place, we go into that state of homeostasis, of balance, where our bodies and nervous systems are constantly striving to be. And when we're in that place of homeostasis, that's where we have capacity for physical healing, increased cognitive function, risk taking, in a positive way, exploration. We're deeply relaxed. We have enjoyment and creativity. It's also where our creative genius can function. And without that feeling of safety, we don't actually have access to those parts of ourselves. So, like when we were talking before, our ancient nervous system is meant to be in this place of homeostasis most of the time. And in this modern society where we're kind of having a lot of stress that's not necessarily natural or what our nervous system is used to, we are often out of that place of homeostasis. So again, we need safe social engagement for homeostasis, for our system to be optimized for health and happiness. And you can see this clearly with infants, right? Infants absolutely need caretaking for their survival. They can't survive without someone feeding them, keeping them warm. So their nervous system is constantly reaching out to assess whether or not they're safe. So they're reaching out to the caregiver. Am I receiving warmth? Am I receiving food? Am I getting my needs met, right? So their nervous system is looking for those cues from the mother. It's the warmth, the feeling of being held. It's the sound of the mother's voice or the caretaker's voice. And it's actually what's going on within the caretaker. The infant nervous system actually feels when the caretaker is stressed. If the caretaker is stressed, that's stressful for the infant, right? Because something's wrong with my caretaker. But when the caretaker is relaxed, right, and present and making really prosodic sounds with the voice and serving food as called for and providing warmth as called for or cried for, right, that allows the nervous system of the infant to relax and be in that place of homeostasis. So this is called co-regulation, the need of that infant nervous system for the nervous system to be informed by the nervous system of the caretaker. So there's a direct communication happening between those two nervous systems. And this continues throughout life to a lesser degree. You can think of times, if you walk into a party, often the first response that we do, or the first thing that we do, is we look around the room for somebody that we know, or we look around the room for a friendly face. Or when you're on a flight in an airplane and there's turbulence, often people will look around at each other, looking for safety, making eye contact, knowing that we're in it together. So I call this sharing a nervous system, this co-regulation. Another example is when something is too overwhelming to process, such as in trauma, we actually need other people to co-regulate with. It's something that our system was not able to process. So we have a close friend, or maybe we have an ally in nature, where we go and we share our experience with and share our nervous system with somebody else who's holding resilience and helping us to find a place of calm within ourselves. We lived as hunter-gatherers until about 10,000 years ago, in small bands of 35 to 100 people or so. We were in these small bands cooperating intentionally. They were people that we trusted, that we depended on, right? It was innate that we trusted these people. We were cooperating and making a life together. The health of one person was the health of the village or of the band. So everyone is helping each other, making things easier for each other. And this is essentially what our nervous systems expect at a certain degree. Even if it's at an unconscious level, this is what our nervous systems evolved with. In modern times, we often have nuclear families or isolation even, or going into social environments that aren't necessarily built for cooperation. Even going to high school, there's a lot of competition and a lot of different people that you don't know, or even going to the supermarket, there's plenty of strangers and just, not as much connection with us, a band of 35 to 100 people working on the same thing together, working on survival together, having bonds that are, generationally passed down. So again, looking at this from the perspective of a child, the child is, again, co-regulating, right? Looking for co-regulation. And in this village scenario, they have their caretaker, their primary caretaker, but they also have, when mom gets tired, they have auntie, right? And they have grandma. And maybe mom's not getting so tired because they also have cousins who are playing with the child. So mom's not having to do all the things. And then mom has grandmom for herself too, right? So she grew up in this container of connection with the village. So she's already feeling really safe in herself because her mother helped her throughout her whole pregnancy and helped her to give birth. And she's always there holding her, right? Mom's already co-regulating with grandma and with others, right? So we have this layered effect of connection being passed down and safety being passed down generationally and being surrounded in this network of connected people. So that is, again, something that our nervous system expects at some level. And going through the 8 shields map, we can look at the different aspects of community, right? What are the parts of community, and do I actually have them in my life, and how can I find those experiences? So like the ages and stages, right? And embodying the archetypes within a healthy culture. So what happens when that actually is a natural experience? We're in a village that naturally has these layers of ages and stages of life. Through our mirror neuron system, we actually share that experience with each other. So the mirror neuron system is a set of neurons in our body that fires off in response to what is being observed in the other. So if I lift my coffee cup and take a drink and you're watching me, the same neurons that you would use to lift that cup light up in you, even if you didn't lift the cup. So we are mimicking each other without moving, without actually doing it. Our nervous system is mimicking that of the person that we are connecting to. So that actually is also true with emotion. It's called the emotional contagion. So if I'm feeling joy, mirror neurons in your body are lighting up with that experience of joy. Same thing with gratitude or awe. So there's a lot of gorgeous potential within emotional contagion. But so if we think of it in the layers of the village, say I'm a 20-year-old in the village, I'm experiencing the joy of the child, right? The innocent beauty of a child when their laughter lights up the village. We're actually experiencing that in our body, in our chemistry, or the love of a new mother, right? That energy is not just hers. That is actually going out into the whole village. And the same thing with the wisdom of an elder, right? That energy, those neurons are there for you as well. So basically, if we have that culture growing up, we start to be able to understand where our role is in the village, what life stage am I at, and where am I going, right? Like I can be an adolescent and look to the 20-year-old and say, wow, that's what I'll be doing, right? And kind of see them as role models, right? And if I'm in my 50s and I see the 80-year-old elder and the wisdom that they're holding, I can see this is where I'm going. So basically, we can look at the 8 shields, layers for village building, for life stages, for the attributes of connection, and then ask, who are the people that are around me? Do I have children that I'm connected to? Do I have aunties and elders and cousins that I trust and feel supported by? And what life stage am I in? And what do I have that attribute embodied? Do I have that attribute of connection for the stage of life that I'm in actually embodied? So we can use it as a way to take inventory on what it would be like to have a healthy culture and how we can start to create and build that into our lives and not just the healthy culture, but also a healthy understanding of where we are within the matrix of a culture.
Well, you're getting me very excited to build village.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wonder, Aiden, your reflections, because you grew up in such a constructed, village-built environment. Does this ring bells for you?
Well, yeah, and I mean, it feels like this is the beginning. Like I feel like we could talk about this for several more episodes because you've painted such a beautiful picture about it. But the other thing that comes to mind for me is that because as humans, our nervous system is designed to be seeking this. It's like we do this in our lives already, whether we're in a healthy culture or not. So it also just begs that question for me too, of how to use 8 Shields principles to kind of assess our own lives and go, okay, I've found, my own version of this that I'm doing, but, how can I assess it to see if I could make it healthier for my nervous system and serve me in a way that, that helps me come more alive.
Great. Well, thank you, Sarah. That's an amazing journey. And you've given us all the neurological justification for why this all makes sense. And really appreciate the time and energy you put into researching all this and, bringing it all together for us. It was really, really helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you all. And I agree that I would love to talk more and more about this, and also just the different layers of the 8 Shields model and how they pertain. The last thing that I just wanted to touch on is our relationships to all the species, which is another layer of the 8 Shields model. And going back to this ancient nervous system where we knew all of the plants, we walked out onto the land and we knew where to get our food and where to get our medicine, and we were in relationship with the trees and fire. We knew where all the animals were and why they were there and when they were there. We knew the rhythms of the weather, and basically lived in that relationship where the earth was providing all that we need. And we had that deep relationship of knowing and experiencing that. And for me, imagining that creates a deep sense of safety. And again, I have to imagine that because that's not, I'm not living directly in relationship in that way. But the feeling of safety is something that I yearn for, that specific experience. And so bringing that homeostasis within from living in harmony with the earth, I believe when humans are in that relationship with nature, it is reflected back to us as ecological homeostasis.
Brilliant. Well, that's a good goal for all of us. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in to our 3rd episode here. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Aiden. And until next time.
Thanks, all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening to Tracking Connections. You can find everything related to the podcast and our current offerings at trackingconnections.net. We'll see you next time.